Noted at Riva Bella, the swell on the Normandy coast, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel told his aide that the invasion would be decided in its first 24 hours, and that for the Allies as well as for Germany, it will be the longest day. The aide was Hauptmann Helmuth Lang, and he wrote it down. Rommel commanded Army Group B and had spent 2 years being right about what his opponents would do next. 6 weeks later, on the morning the longest day arrived, he was 500 miles away in Germany. He had not been fooled by a deception plan or a false radio signal. He had been beaten by a barometer. This is a story about 2 rooms. In one of them, at a Georgian house called Southwick in Hampshire, General Dwight Eisenhower sat with 6 commanders and a Scottish meteorologist and tried to decide whether the English Channel would let him cross it. In the other, in occupied France, German officers looked at the same Atlantic on the same days and reached the opposite conclusion. Both rooms were staffed by professionals. Both were reading real data. Only one of them still had all of it. And the reason is a piece of the story that almost nobody tells. What happened in those 72 hours put 156,000 men on 5 beaches on June 6, 1944. Start with what Eisenhower could not change. The landings needed a full moon so the airborne divisions and the glider pilots could see. They needed low water at first light so the leading craft could see the mined obstacles Rommel had planted across the tidal flats and steer between them. They needed light winds, moderate seas, and cloud high enough for naval gunners to spot their fall of shot. In June 1944, the moon and the tide agreed on exactly 3 days, the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th. After that, the next window was 2 weeks away, and 2 weeks was long enough for the secret to leak. June 5 was chosen. By the first days of the month, the operation had passed the point where it could be quietly held. Men were sealed aboard, landing craft in channel ports. Boys from the west were already sailing on timetables written weeks earlier. Roughly 7,000 vessels, including about 200 warships, were committed to a schedule that assumed a specific dawn. And the one variable nobody in the Allied command could order into compliance was the weather over the western approaches. So Eisenhower did something no supreme commander had done at this scale before. He handed the timing of the war to a forecaster. Weather forecasting in 1944 was not the science it is now. No satellites, no radar picture of the Atlantic, no computer models. A forecast was built by hand from scattered observations, a ship's barometer here, a reconnaissance flight there, a reading from a coastal station in County Mayo on the western edge of Ireland, and drawn onto a chart with a pencil. Beyond about 48 hours, professional opinion held that forecasting was close to guesswork. Eisenhower was asking for a reliable prediction 3 days out, over one of the most unstable stretches of water in the Northern Hemisphere. He had 3 separate teams to ask, and they did not get along. The U.S. Army Air Forces group at WWII in Bushy Park outside London worked from historical analogues, find the closest match for this pattern in the record, and see what it did last time. The Royal Air Force team at Dunstable worked from frontal analysis, temperature, pressure, and humidity mapped into moving air masses. The Royal Navy had its own team down the road from Southwick. The methods were genuinely different, and in the last week of May 1944, they were producing genuinely different answers about the first week of June. Somebody had to turn 3 answers into one. That job belonged to Group Captain James Martin Stagg of the Royal Air Force, Chief Meteorological Officer at Supreme Headquarters, with Colonel Donald Yates of the U.S. Army Air Forces as his deputy. Stagg was 43, 6'2", a geophysicist by training rather than a soldier, and had been given RAF rank largely so that a room full of generals and admirals would listen to him. Eisenhower's own description of him was a dour but canny Scot. He briefed the commanders every 12 hours. By the end of May, he was barely sleeping. What made Stagg's position almost impossible was that he had no authority over any of the 3 teams and no right to overrule them. He could only listen to them argue on a telephone line, decide which argument he believed, and then walk into a room, state it as a single flat prediction to the man commanding the invasion of Europe. He could not hedge. Eisenhower had told him plainly that he did not want ifs and maybes. So every 12 hours, Stagg took the disagreement of a dozen scientists, resolved it in his own head, and carried the answer up the drive alone. Subscribe before the next chapter, because the second half of this story is the German room, and what was happening in it on those same nights is stranger than anything at Southwick House. Stay with me, because on June 3, a coastal observation from Western Ireland reached Dunstable and confirmed what the British team had feared for days. A deep Atlantic depression was moving east. It was going to arrive over the Channel at almost exactly the hour the first wave was due to touch down, and Stagg had to go and say so. Southwick House sits a few miles north of Portsmouth. The room used for these meetings is a former library, roughly 25 feet by 50, with the shelves emptied and a long table under a green cloth. On the evening of June 3, the men around it are Eisenhower, Montgomery, Sir Bertram Ramsay, who had run the evacuation from Dunkirk, Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory, Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford, whose pessimism about the airborne drop had already cost Eisenhower sleep, Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, and Major General Walter Bedell Smith. Stagg comes in and tells them the 5th will not do. He is describing gale force wind, low cloud, and a sea state that would swamp flat-bottomed craft, blind the naval spotters, and ground the air forces. The Americans at WWII disagree. Their historical analogues still show a ridge of high pressure deflecting the front. It is a real scientific dispute between competent people, and the man who has to resolve it holds no command. Outside the windows of the library that evening is beautiful. Some of the officers look out at the sunset and wonder whether the Scotsman has lost his nerve. 04 hours, June 4. They meet again. Stagg says almost nothing has changed. Eisenhower weighs it and concludes that without air support the risk is unacceptable. He asks the room for dissent and gets none, then instructs Bedell Smith to inform the combined chiefs that Overlord is postponed 24 hours and to recall the ships already at sea. That recall is one of the most dangerous pieces of seamanship of the entire war. Convoys turned around in worsening weather, in radio silence, without collision, and without being spotted. That is the halfway point of this story. And the invasion of Europe has just been called off. June 5 arrives exactly as the British team predicted. Rain, wind at Beaufort Force 5, a channel no landing craft should be in. Eisenhower has bought himself one day and spent it. If the weather does not break, the next tidally viable window is roughly 2 weeks out, and every extra day is another day for a sealed force of 156,000 men to leak the secret. But late on the evening of June 4, the picture had already shifted. The depression slowed. Between it and the next system, a ridge of high pressure supported by the Azores High began to nose into the gap. Stagg walks back into the library on the evening of June 4 and tells them there will be a break. Not good weather. Survivable weather for roughly 36 hours from the night of the 5th through the 6th before the next system closes it. Winds easing to force 3 or 4. Cloud base high enough for the gunners. Getting the sequence of these 4 meetings right took hours, because the popular versions compress them into one dramatic scene and the times get mangled. If that is the kind of care you want in your history, hit like. 1 like, nothing else. 445 hours, June 5. Eisenhower wakes at 3:30 in a shaking tent, walks up to the house through hard rain and hears Stagg confirm it. He polls the room. It is not unanimous. There are men present who would still wait. Then he gets up and paces the floor with his head down and his hands behind his back, and the room stays silent for what several of the men present remembered as minutes. Then he stops, turns, and gives the order. Eyewitnesses recorded his exact words differently, which is its own small lesson in history. Everyone agrees on what he meant. Overlord was going on June 6. Now cross the Channel and go back 3 days. German meteorologists were watching the same depression and reading it correctly. Where they failed was on the far side of it. The Luftwaffe's forecasters assessed that rough seas and strong winds were persisted into the middle of June and saw no break at all. That assessment was not incompetence. Because, by June 1944, Germany had lost at every source. had lost almost every source that fed it. The Atlantic weather ships were gone, the reporting stations in Greenland and the far north were gone. Allied action had taken them one by one over 3 years. Weather moves west to east across the North Atlantic. That single fact decided the argument. The Allies had the western approaches covered. Weather ships on station, reconnaissance flights out of the United Kingdom, everyday observers on the Irish coast, and, at the far end, the ability to read German weather broadcasts as well as their own. They could see systems coming for 2 or 3 days. The Germans were looking at the same sky from the downwind side, with a fraction of the data, trying to predict what was arriving from an ocean they could no longer observe. Both rooms were professional. One of them was working half-blind. The consequences were not academic. On the strength of that forecast, units along the coast were told to stand down. General Friedrich Dollmann, commanding the German 7th Army, had scheduled a map exercise at Rennes for the morning of June 6, a war game testing the response to an Allied landing. Rennes is over 100 miles from the Normandy beaches. His divisional commanders were on the road to it. General Wilhelm Falley of the 91st Air Landing Division heard aircraft engined his car around and was killed by American paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne. He was the first German general to die in Normandy. And Rommel went home. Early on June 5, he left his headquarters at the Chateau of La Roche-Guyon on the Seine and had himself driven to Herlingen in Germany, carrying a pair of shoes bought Harris' wife Lucy, whose birthday was June 6. He also intended to see Hitler and argue again for direct control of the armoured reserves he would need if a landing came. He got the birthday, he did not get the meeting. The man who had said the first 24 hours would decide everything spent the opening of those 24 hours in a car, driving back across France. Set the two rooms side by side and the shape of it is clear. Eisenhower's forecast was not better because his scientists were cleverer. It was better because his side still had the instruments. Years of Allied operations against weather ships and northern stations had never been sold to anybody as war-winning work, and none of the men who did it knew what it would eventually buy. What it bought was 36 hours that only one side could see, and a German chain of command with its army commanders at a map exercise, its divisional commanders in cars, and its army group commander in another country. There is one more document from that night. Some time after he gave the order, Eisenhower took a pad and wrote a short message in pencil for release if the landings failed. It says that the landings have failed to gain a foothold, that he has withdrawn the troops, that the decision to attack when and where he did was based on the best information available, and that the soldiers, the airmen, and the sailors did everything that bravery and devotion to duty could do. Then it says that if any blame attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. He folded it into his wallet and forgot it was there. He got the date wrong. He wrote July 5 instead of June 5, which is what exhaustion looks like in handwriting. Weeks later, his naval aide, Captain Harry C. Butcher, found the note still in the wallet and asked what it was. Eisenhower had meant to destroy it. Butcher kept it instead, which is the only reason it exists. It is now held by the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas. It is roughly 60 words long. It was written by a man who had just committed 156,000 people to a beach, and it takes the entire blame for a failure that had not happened yet, and never did. There is an honest footnote in 3 parts. First, the lone Scotsman versus. The Americans' version of this story is a simplification. Stagg had a deputy, Colonel Donald Yates, 3 teams and a dozen scientists, and the disagreements were professional rather than personal. The American method was wrong on this occasion. It was not stupid. Second, Eisenhower's exact words at 041 on June 5 are genuinely disputed. Witnesses in that room wrote down different sentences, and the most quoted version is not securely attested. Third, the note in the wallet is usually dated to the night of June 5, but the only date on it is wrong, and the hour he wrote it has never been established. The verdict came 13 days later. Between June 19 and 22, the worst storm to hit the Normandy, Anchorage, destroyed the artificial harbour at Omaha, damaged the one at Gold, and wrecked hundreds of craft. It fell across the next window Eisenhower would have used. He read the summary afterward and wrote across the top of it that they should thank the gods of war they went when they did. He died on March 28, 1969, and was buried in Abilene, Kansas, at his own instruction in an $80 government issue casket, wearing the plain field jacket the Army was named after him for. The note is 200 feet away behind glass. If your family had someone in the ETO, a beach, a bomber group, a landing craft, a headquarters heard of, put them in the comments, not just the unit. Tell us one thing about them. A habit, a grudge, a story they told once. Commanders get libraries. Everybody else gets whoever remembers to write it down.